The war in the Pacific is one of the most fascinating aspects of the Second World War. Countless books, movies, and TV shows have been made about the subject, and for good reason. However, many myths have formed surrounding the Pacific conflict, and today we are going to debunk the 5 most common myths about the war in the Pacific. Number 5. The Americans triumphed against overwhelming odds at the Battle of Midway. The American victory at Midway has often been described as a victory against all odds, and that Japanese victory looked almost predetermined. These statements are simply not true. Let's start by looking at a comparison of the overall forces, from Jonathan B. Parshall's book, Shattered Sword. It is quite true that in May of 1942, the Japanese combined fleet enjoyed an aggregate numerical advantage over the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, and conceivably could have brought overwhelming firepower to bear anywhere in that theater of operations. It is further true that the bulk of the combined fleet was indeed operating in support of Operations AL and MI on the morning of June 4th. But the Japanese battle plan ensured that the majority of this force could not have engaged any American units on that day. Jonathan B. Parshall makes it clear that the only 2 Japanese forces worth considering on that day were the ones present at the point of tactical contact, Nagumo's mobile striking force based around 4 carriers, and Tanaka's invasion force. We can further ignore Tanaka's invasion force given it had no capability of offensive action. Nagumo brought 20 warships to face the U.S. Navy's 25. He was operating a grand total of 4 aircraft carriers and 248 carrier aircraft. The Americans, between their 3 carriers, mounted a total of 233 carrier aircraft and could call upon another 120-odd aircraft from Midway. It is clear to see that it was the Japanese who were outnumbered in terms of aircraft during this engagement. The presence of Shokaku and Zuikaku would be sorely missed. Number 4. Midway was the end for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Many accounts of the Battle of Midway imply that the majority of the Japanese air crews participating in the battle were killed. However, this is not true. Careful sifting of the evidence in recent years has shown that in fact only about 110 Japanese flyers died at Midway, most of them from the Hiryu. No more than a quarter of the carrier air crews the Navy had at the start of the battle. American aircrew losses were actually greater than those of the Japanese, if Marine Corps aviators from Midway Island itself are included in the tally. While losing 110 aviators was without a doubt a significant blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier arm, it was not nearly as damaging as previously thought. The real turning point in the Pacific War came with the Guadalcanal campaign. It was here that the Americans put the Japanese through an attritional meat grinder style of warfare, which the Japanese were not proficient in. The Japanese naval air arm's main blow came at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October of 1942. It was here that they lost 148 aviators, the greatest single loss of carrier air crews the Japanese suffered to date. Among them were important veteran crew members, such as torpedo bomber pilot Shigeharu Murata, who commanded the torpedo bombers that crippled several U.S. Navy battleships at Pearl Harbor. While it is true that the Japanese carrier arm suffered a major defeat at Midway, the truly fatal blow would come a few months later. Number 3. Nagumo should have launched a 3rd wave against Pearl Harbor. While the attack on Pearl Harbor succeeded in crushing American air power and crippling the American battleships, Admiral Nagumo has been continuously criticized for not launching a 3rd wave to hit the American fuel tanks and ship repair facilities. Many have stated that this was a massive mistake by Nagumo, and that the attack would have been far more successful if he had launched a 3rd wave. While there are many instances where it is fair to critique Nagumo's leadership, this particular criticism stems from more myth than fact. There was simply not enough daylight left for Nagumo to launch a 3rd wave against Pearl Harbor. Historian Richard B. Frank explains this clearly. Each strike consumed about 4 hours from launch to recovery. At best, it would require between 2 and 3 hours to formulate and issue a plan for a third strike, as well as concurrently to repair, refuel, and rearm aircraft. At the very best, this means no launch of a third strike before 1415 with a more likely time of about 1500. This translates into a recovery between 1815 and 1900. But sunset on December 7, 1941 occurred at 1712, and the last trace of the horizon disappeared at the end of nautical twilight at 1805. Thus, the third strike would have had to land in darkness. This factor alone would render the whole concept infeasible. Number 2. Japan had a shot at winning the Pacific War. Victory for the Japanese was extremely unlikely. While it is very difficult to ever assert something as having an absolute 0% chance of happening in an alternate history scenario, when one analyzes the data, it truly gives the Americans an eventual guarantee of victory. The following statement from H.P. Wilmot brings this point home. Such was the scale of American industrial power that if during the Pearl Harbor attack, the Imperial Navy had been able to sink every major unit of the entire U.S. Navy and then complete its own construction programs without losing a single unit, by mid-1944, it would still not have been able to put to sea a fleet equal to the one the Americans could have assembled in the intervening 30 months. Many members of the Japanese leadership did not see the long-term threat of going to war with the United States. However, certain members of the high command, such as Admiral Yamamoto, did see the threat. Yamamoto had the following to say about the prospect of war with the United States and Great Britain. In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success. Number 1, Japan was already outmatched at the start of hostilities. During the initial stages of the Pacific War, the Imperial Japanese Navy was truly a force to be reckoned with. At the opening of the Pacific War, it comprised 10 battleships, including the first of the 2 greatest battleships ever built, 10 aircraft carriers, 38 cruisers, heavy and light, 112 destroyers, 65 submarines, and numerous auxiliary warships of lesser size. To have observed the Japanese battle line early in the Pacific War must have been among the great spectacles in modern naval history. Jonathan B. Parshall has stated the following about the Imperial Navy. It is not a stretch to state that in June 1942, Japan possessed the most powerful navy in the world in many respects. The Navy had opened the war with a stunning attack on Pearl Harbor, followed up by the destruction of the Prince of Wales and Repulse, and then proceeded to systematically crush the Allied flotillas in the Philippines and around Java. Powerful raids against Port Darwin in Australia and then into the Indian Ocean had cemented Nihon Kaigun's fearsome reputation. With regards to the Japanese carrier force, Parshall had the following to say: Japan's carrier force in particular was truly without peer. At Pearl Harbor, it demonstrated a level of sophistication that the U.S. Navy would not be able to replicate for another 2 years. Whereas the Allies were still using their flight decks singly or in pairs, Japan had used 6 fleet carriers to sweep American air power aside and smash a major naval base in broad daylight. In terms of their ability to use massed air power, the Imperial Navy had no rival. We hope you enjoyed this video. Do you agree or disagree with any of the points we made? Let us know in the comments down below.